If I trace it back carefully, not to one event but to a feeling, I think the first shape of it began in childhood. Not the secret itself, because children do not always have words for what they protect. It began as a private method of surviving pressure. That is the best way I can describe it now. I did not wake up one day and decide to become someone else. I slowly learned how to soften inside a life that always seemed to demand hardness from me. At school, people noticed before I did. Or maybe they noticed what they wanted to notice. The way I stood too carefully. The way I disliked rough games and loud jokes that depended on someone being humiliated. The way my hands moved when I spoke. The way I kept my notebooks neat, my pencils lined up, my shirt as pressed as I could manage. Boys are permitted many flaws, but softness is rarely one of them. So they gave me names. Some were childish. Some were cruel enough to stay in the mind for decades. I learned not to react. That became the first rule. If they laughed, I would not give them the reward of a wounded face. If they pushed me, I would straighten my shoulders and pretend not to mind. If a teacher saw and did nothing, I would tell myself it did not matter. But it did matter. It mattered every single day. Pressure does not always break a person dramatically. More often, it settles like dust. It layers itself over the years until you start breathing it without realizing. At home, things were quieter but not easier. My father believed in clear lines. Men worked, endured, provided, and kept moving. Women cared, decorated, soothed, and carried the emotional burden without calling attention to it. He did not say these things every day. He did not have to. A household teaches through repetition, through tone, through what earns approval and what earns silence. My mother was gentle, but tired. She survived by not disturbing the arrangement. I loved her for her kindness and grieved, even then, how little room she had to rest inside it. What I envied was not womanhood in any theatrical sense. It was permission. Permission to be careful. Permission to be beautiful in private. Permission to handle one's own emotions as if they deserved tenderness instead of discipline. I did not have language for identity, expression, or self-concept. I had only instinct. When I was alone, I would linger in quiet routines that felt strangely restorative. Folding fabric. Smoothing a sleeve between my fingers. Washing my face slowly before bed instead of splashing water on it like a duty. Noticing scent, texture, color, order. The small rituals that made me feel less like a machine built for endurance. Years later, I would call this the gentle transformation. Not because it changed my body in some dramatic way, and not because it belonged to fantasy. It was gentle because it asked nothing violent of me. It did not demand that I overthrow my life. It only asked that I stop treating myself like an enemy. At first it was hardly visible. A different kind of soap. A comb used with care instead of impatience. Clean socks chosen for softness. A private interest in elegance, not to perform for others, but to calm the noise inside myself. School became bearable only because I developed an inner room where other people could not enter. That room was made of routine. I would return home, close the door, wash the day from my hands, and begin again. I would sit still for a few minutes and let my breathing slow. Sometimes I would imagine a version of myself untouched by ridicule. Not stronger in the usual sense. Softer, but steadier. Someone who moved through the world with quiet dignity, even if no one else understood it. There is a strange loneliness in protecting something before you fully understand what it is. I knew enough to hide. That knowledge arrives early in certain lives. You do not need vocabulary to recognize danger. I knew which expressions on my father's face meant disappointment. I knew which subjects boys brought up when they wanted to test each other's masculinity. I knew how quickly affection could turn into suspicion if a boundary, invisible but fiercely guarded, was crossed. So I became observant. I watched how people performed themselves. I noticed how many men seemed exhausted by the role they were defending. How many of them spoke about strength while looking spiritually starved. I wondered if they had inner rooms too, locked and unvisited. I wondered whether everyone carried some version of this loneliness, whether mine was only more visible because I had fewer instincts for disguise. By the time I was 16, mockery no longer surprised me. What surprised me was how little it changed the truth I felt in private. Shame can be powerful, but it is not always persuasive. Even then, under all the pressure, some deeper part of me kept reaching toward care, toward softness, toward the calm I felt when I moved slowly and deliberately, when I treated routine not as maintenance, but as mercy. That was the beginning, though I would not have known it then. Not a secret revealed. A self, quietly assembling under pressure, learning to survive by becoming gentle where the world insisted on hardness. Adulthood did not erase any of this. It simply gave it better furniture and more respectable disguises. I left school, found work, paid bills, learned how to shake hands firmly, and became reliable in the ways people admire. I was punctual. I listened more than I spoke. I did not drink too much, did not complain too loudly, did not make anyone uncomfortable with the complicated truth of me. Men like that are often described as solid, stable, good. What nobody asks is how much of that steadiness is built from concealment. In my 20s, loneliness changed its clothing. As a child, loneliness had felt like exclusion. In adult life, it felt more like successful imitation. People accepted me, even liked me, but only through the version of myself I knew how to present. I learned office humor. I learned restraint. I learned how to participate in conversations that skimmed across the surface of life without ever touching the water beneath. Every now and then someone would say I was sensitive for a man, and they meant it as praise, but even praise can feel like a warning when it points too closely toward what you are trying to protect. I married in my early 30s. She was kind, intelligent, and patient in ways I probably did not deserve. I loved her honestly, which is why the incompleteness of my honesty pained me so deeply. There are people who think secrets only matter if they involve betrayal in the dramatic sense. They do not understand the smaller grief of withholding a private language from someone you sleep beside every night. My wife knew I was inward, careful, not easily explained. She knew I found peace and order in home routines, in the domestic details other men joked about. She would smile when I refold blankets after guests had left, or when I cared too much about the softness of towels, or when I chose candles with understated scents. She called me particular. I let her call me that because it was close enough to truth to survive. The gentle transformation deepened during those years, though it remained invisible from the outside. It became a philosophy of conduct. When the world bruised me, I answered with care. When work humiliated me with its petty politics and performance, I came home and restored myself through order. I trimmed my nails neatly. I moisturized dry hands roughened by winter air. I chose sleepwear for comfort and quiet beauty, even though no one would see it but me. I learned that presentation can be an act of self-respect even in solitude, especially in solitude. I am aware that some people would want more spectacle from a story like mine. A discovery, a dramatic purchase, a locked drawer flung open. But life is rarely transformed by single gestures. Mine was shaped by repetition, by what I reached for at the end of difficult days, by the version of myself I allowed to exist when no one was watching. It was not costume. It was correction, a rebalancing. Each private act of gentleness repaired some small injury inflicted by the world's constant demand that I be less feeling, less graceful, less myself. When my wife passed away after a brief illness, the house changed temperature. That is the only way I can explain grief. The same walls, the same chairs, the same kitchen table, but all warmth rearranged into absence. I discovered then how much of my life had been held together by being witnessed, even imperfectly. She had not known every hidden chamber of me, but her presence had softened the loneliness. After her funeral, the silence became a kind of weather system. Mornings were the worst. Even the kettle sounded abandoned. Grief stripped away performance. For months, I moved through the days as if underwater. I worked because work required less imagination than living. I answered messages. I paid invoices. I thanked people for casseroles and condolences. Then, at night, I returned to my quiet rituals not out of preference but necessity. Showering slowly, choosing clean, gentle fabrics, smoothing lotion into my hands with the attention of someone proving that a body still exists and deserves care. These actions were not glamorous. They were rescue. When your emotional life collapses, routine becomes a railing you can grip in the dark. My son was already grown by then, busy building his own life. I do not blame him for that. Youth is naturally forward-facing. It does not know yet how quickly a parent's interior world can become fragile. He visited, he called, he did what decent sons do, but there was a reserve between us that I never found the courage to cross. Fathers and sons are often given such narrow scripts. Advice, stoicism, logistical support, pride without tenderness, concern without vulnerability. I told myself there would be time later. Later is one of the most dangerous words in family life. As the years passed, the gentle transformation ceased to be merely private recovery and became the central moral logic of my life. I stopped thinking of it as something I hid because it was shameful. I began to see that I hid it because people are clumsy with what they do not understand. My softness was never the threat. Their fear of softness was. That realization did not make me reckless, but it did make me calmer. I no longer felt like a fraud in my own home. If I arranged my space beautifully, if I dressed in ways that soothed me in private, if I moved through my evenings with grace instead of efficiency, I was not deceiving anyone. I was finally caring for the person who had endured decades of pressure with almost no witness at all. And still, despite all this quiet self-acceptance, one fear remained. Not society. Not strangers. My son. Because it is one thing to survive ridicule from classmates or judgment from coworkers. It is another to imagine disappointment in the eyes of someone whose existence once taught you what love could be. My son discovered my secret in the most ordinary way possible, which feels fitting now. Not through confrontation. Not through scandal. Through a winter afternoon, a misplaced key, and a son arriving early to help me move a heavy cabinet. I had stepped out briefly to collect a package from the front porch. He must have let himself in, calling my name the way he always did, too loudly, as if fathers lose hearing when they grow old. I answered from the hallway, told him I would be right there. By the time I entered the bedroom, he was standing still, not angry, not shocked in the dramatic way films like to portray, just still. On the bed were the visible pieces of a life I had kept carefully folded into privacy. The soft robe I wore in the evenings, skin care laid out in calm sequence, garments selected less for display than for the feeling of peace they brought me, and the unmistakable atmosphere of a room arranged around tenderness rather than masculine neglect. He looked at me as if several decades had shifted out of place. I spoke first, though I cannot remember the exact sentence. Something practical, probably. The kind of sentence people use when they cannot yet bear the truth of what is happening. He asked one question after another, each more restrained than the last. Was this a joke? Had someone been here? How long? Did anyone else know? The real question underneath them all was harder. Who are you if this is also you? There are moments when the entire architecture of a relationship becomes visible. I saw in his face the child I had raised, the young man I had encouraged, the adult shaped partly by my silences. I had spent years telling myself I was protecting him from confusion. Standing there, I began to understand I had also protected myself from being known. I tried to explain, but explanation is difficult when the listener is not yet listening. I told him it was private, long-standing, not dangerous, not a performance meant to mock anyone, not a betrayal of his mother, not a sudden madness of old age. I told him it was part of how I survived loneliness and pressure, part of how I cared for myself, part of a gentleness I had needed all my life. He heard only fragments. I could see it. The human mind, when frightened, edits truth into whatever confirms its alarm. He left that day with politeness colder than shouting. That hurt more. Anger can still be intimate. Politeness can exile. The weeks after were harder than the mockery of school, harder than widowhood in one particular sense. Grief from strangers is impersonal, but grief inside family enters the bloodstream. He stopped calling. Messages went unanswered. When he did respond, it was brief, duty-strained, as if he were speaking to someone who resembled his father but had slipped sideways into unreliability. I wanted to defend myself. I wanted to list every sacrifice I had made, every school fee paid, every fever sat through, every late-night worry, every act of fatherhood that had been real and constant regardless of what he had discovered in a bedroom. But pain rarely yields to argument. So I did what I had always done. I returned to routine. I made tea each evening. I tidied the kitchen. I cared for my clothes and skin and spirit with a devotion that no longer felt secretive so much as necessary. Yet even these rituals changed under the new weight of loss. Before, they had soothed loneliness. Now they also protected dignity. If my son could not understand me, I would not punish myself on his behalf. That became a new principle. Private self-expression was not the cause of my suffering. Silence and fear had caused far more. Memory worked on me during that season. I remembered him as a boy, sitting at the edge of my bed while I tied his shoes for school. I remembered how carefully he once handled an injured bird, afraid to squeeze too hard. I remembered his tears when his mother died, how he leaned against me in the kitchen and let himself become a child again for 3 trembling minutes. People are never one thing, no matter how fearfully they behave. I held on to that. I told myself that shock is often a temporary mask worn by love when love feels unprepared. Friends, had I told them, might have advised distance. Protect yourself, they would say. Let him come around or don't. But parenthood does not retire so neatly. Even when children are grown, part of the heart continues waiting by the door. I did not want to chase him, yet I could not let the silence harden into a permanent misunderstanding. The difficulty was this: anything long, defensive, or explanatory would sound like panic. And panic invites judgment. What I needed was clarity stripped of performance. One evening, after another unanswered voicemail, I sat by the window and watched the streetlights come on. The room around me was orderly, quiet, intentionally beautiful in the modest way I had learned to value. I looked at my hands resting in my lap, older now, lined, cared for, and I felt something settle inside me. Not defeat, not even resignation, recognition. For most of my life, I had tried to make myself easier for others to digest, less visible, less complicated, less true in public, so that the private truth could survive. But what had survival been for, if not eventually for peace? The gentle transformation had started as protection. Over time it had become self-respect. Now, at last, it demanded honesty, not theatrical honesty, not confessional spectacle, just a refusal to apologize for the form my healing had taken. That night, I sent my son 4 words. I am still Dad. Then I put down the phone, washed my face, folded the robe on the bed, and went to sleep without rehearsing any further defense. For the first time since he had walked into that room, I understood that love cannot be negotiated through shame. It can only be offered from the clearest truth one can bear. He did not answer immediately. In stories, for honest words often unlock the next scene as if human beings were doors and truth the correct key. Real life is slower. Real life keeps its distance even after the message is sent. 3 days passed. Then 5. I continued with my routines, not because I had become serene overnight, but because the body still needs guiding when the heart is unsettled. I woke at the same time each morning. I opened the curtains. I made coffee. I walked to the corner shop when the weather allowed. I took care with my appearance, even alone. Especially alone. If no one else was going to witness my dignity, then I would witness it myself. There is maturity, I think, in learning that peace is not the absence of pain. Peace is the decision not to let pain choose your posture. In younger years, I would have read silence as punishment and rushed to undo it. I would have apologized too broadly, explained too much, reduced myself until the other person felt tall again. But old age had given me one invaluable gift: exhaustion with self-betrayal. I loved my son. I wanted him back in my life. Yet I could no longer offer him a version of me built from denial. That bargain had already cost too much. On the 7th day, he replied with a single line. I don't understand any of this. I stared at the message for a long time, not because it was cruel, but because it was honest. And honesty, even raw honesty, creates a bridge where politeness only builds distance. I answered simply, "You don't have to understand all at once." That began our strange, halting correspondence. Not reconciliation yet. More like two people feeling their way across a collapsed section of road. He asked what this meant. I told him it meant I had spent many years discovering that gentleness was not weakness, and that private expression helped me remain emotionally alive. He asked whether I wanted to be someone else. I told him no, that the problem had never been being his father. The problem had been surviving a life that treated softness as failure. He asked why I had never told him. That question took the longest to answer. Because fathers are taught to be examples, I wrote. And I was afraid that if you saw my full humanity, you would think less of the lessons I tried to give you. He did not respond for hours. Then, "Maybe I'm angry because you never trusted me." That landed with the clean pain of truth. We often assume rejection comes from what we are, when sometimes it comes from when and how others are allowed to know us. I had hidden myself for reasons that once felt protective and wise. But concealment creates its own wound. My son was not only reacting to the secret. He was reacting to the years of curated distance that had made the secret feel like a stranger living in his father's house. When he finally agreed to visit, I spent the morning cleaning not because the house needed it, but because ritual steadied me. I arranged the living room with care. Nothing performative. Nothing strategic. Simply the home as I actually lived in it now. Quiet, balanced, softened by the tastes I had once confined to private corners. When he arrived, he stood at the doorway for a moment with the uncertain expression of someone entering both a familiar place and an unfamiliar truth. We sat with tea between us. It felt almost absurdly polite at first. Weather, traffic, work. The small talk of frightened men. Then he looked around and said, more to the room than to me. Mom would have noticed. I smiled, sad and warm at once. She noticed more than I ever admitted. He looked down at his cup. Did she know? Not every detail, I said. But she knew I needed gentleness. She knew I became myself through care. That seemed to reach him in a way labels would not have. Perhaps because it moved the conversation away from categories and toward recognizable human need. Everyone understands the hunger to become oneself through care, even if they use different language for it. We talked for hours, though talked is too smooth a word. We circled, paused, retreated, tried again. He confessed he had felt embarrassed, then guilty for feeling embarrassed. He worried what it meant about his childhood memories, whether any of them had been false. I told him memories can remain true even when later knowledge deepens them. I had been his father every day. I packed lunches, paid bills, sat through parent meetings, taught him to drive, and stood beside him at his mother's grave. Nothing about my private life erased those realities. If anything, it explained how hard I had worked to remain kind under pressures that might have made another man bitter. At one point he asked, very quietly, "Were you unhappy all those years?" I took my time before answering. "Often lonely," I said. "Not always unhappy. There's a difference. I had love in my life. I had purpose. But I also had a private self that learned to survive without witness." Something changed in his face then. Not full understanding, but compassion beginning to organize itself. He had reached the age where life had disappointed him enough to respect complexity. That helped. Youth wants clarity. Adulthood, if it matures well, learns to tolerate contradiction. When he left that evening, he hugged me. Briefly, awkwardly, but fully. After the door closed, I stood in the hallway and let myself feel the relief, without dramatizing it. Not all wounds heal in one conversation. But something essential had shifted. The secret was no longer a sealed room in the house of my life. Air had entered. So had risk. So had possibility. And perhaps that is what peace actually requires. Not perfect acceptance, but enough truth in the room that love no longer has to stumble in darkness. In the months that followed, my son and I built a new relationship from materials both fragile and durable. Honesty, discomfort, memory, patience, love. He did not transform into a perfectly enlightened man overnight, nor did I expect him to. He had inherited more than my eyes and my caution. He had inherited a culture.
So had I.
We were both trying, in our own late ways, to become gentler than the world that formed us. He began to ask practical questions rather than fearful ones. What routines helped me feel calm? How long I had known? Whether I ever felt shame now? That last question stayed with me. I answered him truthfully, sometimes out of habit. Shame learned early does not vanish because the mind has outgrown it. But I no longer obey it. That, I told him, is the difference. The gentle transformation was never about becoming a fantasy or escaping responsibility. It was about refusing emotional starvation, about understanding that care is not trivial. A brushed fabric, a quiet evening ritual, a graceful posture in solitude, a home arranged around softness instead of neglect. These are small things until they save your life. People speak grandly about resilience, but often resilience is built from unglamorous acts repeated with devotion. Wash the face. Fold the clothes. Light the room warmly.
Breathe.
Return to yourself. Begin again tomorrow. My son listened differently after that. Maybe because he had his own burdens by then, his own fractures hidden behind adult confidence. Once, while helping me carry groceries, he admitted he often felt numb after work and did not know how to come back to himself. I almost laughed at the tenderness of life. There we were, 2 generations of men standing by a kitchen counter, both trying to learn what should have been taught to us long ago, that self-care is not indulgence, that softness is not surrender, that dignity can be quiet. I showed him simple things, though not as lessons, more as invitations. Make the evening intentional. Do one task slowly. Don't treat your body like equipment. Let your surroundings help you. Choose one act of care that belongs only to you and guard it from cynicism. He nodded with the seriousness people reserve for truths they wish they had discovered sooner. We never turned my secret into a family spectacle. There was no grand declaration, no dramatic cleansing of the past. Life continued in its ordinary rhythm, which I now see as a kind of grace. We met for lunch. He called more often. Sometimes he still stumbled over the edges of what he knew about me. Sometimes I still heard old caution in my own voice. But between us there was increasingly less fear and more room. One spring afternoon, nearly a year after that winter discovery, he visited with his daughter, my granddaughter. She ran through the house with the unfiltered curiosity children carry before the world teaches them which details to mock and which to ignore. She paused in the hallway, touched the sleeve of a robe hanging neatly by the bedroom door, and said, "Grandpa, this is soft." "Yes," I said, smiling. "It is." She smiled back as if softness were the most ordinary fact in the world. After they left, I stood alone in the quiet and thought about the long path from schoolyard ridicule to this gentle little moment. All those years of pressure, all those private rituals, all the loneliness, all the care. I had once believed my life was divided into acceptable surfaces and hidden truths. Now I understood it differently. My life had been a continuous attempt to remain emotionally alive in conditions that did not make that easy. The transformation had been gentle because violence would have destroyed me. Gentleness kept me here. If there is wisdom in age, perhaps it is this: the self does not always arrive like thunder. Sometimes it gathers like evening light, touching familiar objects until you see them clearly at last. My softness was never an accident, never a failure, never a joke waiting to be exposed. It was a language of survival, a discipline of care, a way of refusing the loneliness that pressure tried to make permanent. And the secret that once seemed capable of costing me everything ultimately gave me something I had not thought possible at my age: clarity. Not the clarity of labels, though they have their place. The clarity of knowing that I had done my best to live decently, to love my family sincerely, and to care for the wounded parts of myself without cruelty. My son did not need a perfect father. He needed a real one. At last he had one. That evening, I moved slowly through my usual routine. I straightened the room, washed my hands, folded fabric with calm attention. The old gestures remained, but they no longer felt like hiding. They felt like home. Outside, the light faded. Inside, everything was quiet and in its place. For the first time in many years, I felt no need to defend the life I had made in private. I only felt gratitude for having survived long enough to understand it. I am still Dad, I had written. What I know now is that those 4 words were not only for my son. They were for me too. If you want, I can also turn this into